Hello and welcome to today's webinar on getting started in Scottish research. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Vice President of Education and Programming here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator for today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Now, today's program is also being produced in partnership with the National Trust for Scotland Foundation USA, which encourages Americans to connect with the things that make Scotland unique, from coastlines to castles, from art to architecture, from wildlife to wilderness, and to protect them for future generations. Our presenter today is David Allen Lambert, Chief Genealogist here at American Ancestors. David has been a member of the NEHGS staff since 1993. He is an internationally recognized speaker on the topics of genealogy and history. His interests and areas of genealogical expertise include New England and Atlantic Canadian records of the 17th through 21st centuries, military records, DNA research, Scottish and English research, Native American and African American genealogical research in New England, to name just a few. Now, Scots have been migrating to and settling in America and Canada for centuries, and today there are an estimated 25 million Americans of Scottish descent. Tracing your Scottish heritage is, of course, rewarding, but it's also not without its challenges. So today, David will discuss some of the first steps and some foundational information for really getting started in tracing your Scottish roots. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There is a syllabus for this session that can be purchased from our online bookstore. You'll find a link to that downloadable PDF in your reminder emails, as well as in your follow-up email that will be sent after today's broadcast. We are also recording this event, and starting later today, you can freely go back and review any of the content. So if you miss something on today's first listen, maybe you can't take notes fast enough, not to worry. You can always review this presentation later. You can pause it, you can go back, and you can really listen to it at your leisure. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to David.
Thank you, Ginevra. Welcome, everyone. I would say that the most amazing part of Europe to explore is the Highlands. Scotland is a beautiful country, a historic country, and definitely a treasure trove of genealogical and historical records to be found. And I'm delighted to give you this introduction talk today, getting started. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about a trip that we're doing in June to Scotland to do research firsthand. So some common challenges in Scottish family history research, and I started falling into these pitfalls when I met my wife 35 years ago. Her grandfather was from Scotland, and I have some examples of her own family in these records today. The main thing that you're going to find occasionally difficult is finding the exact location other than Scotland in early American records. Now, for her research, it was pretty simple. Her grandfather came over in the 1920s, so naturalization records, passenger lists are right there. But if your family came over from Scotland in the 1730s, it gets a little bit more difficult. The other problem, common surnames. How many McDonalds and Mackenzies have you met in your lifetime? And are they all related to the same clan? Are they all tied into the same part of Scotland? So there comes a little problematic when you're doing geographical pinpointing. And of course, finding church records that predate the 1700s, unlike England, where you will find Anglican church records dating back in some cases to the 16th century. Scotland records can sometimes sort of peter out in the early 1700s. Some strategies for Scottish research. First off, don't leap across the pond too soon, and don't leap too soon when you don't find something online. There's always a treasure trove of records that are not digitized, and we are going to talk about a combination of both today. Understand the history of Scotland, specifically where your ancestors lived and when your ancestors lived there, because knowing the locations will better pinpoint you to what was going on. Learn the migration history for your Scottish ancestors who arrived in America or in Canada. Why did they immigrate? Particular time frames are very much important to understand the reason. Maybe it was for the clearances. Maybe they were a Scottish prisoner of war. Take oral tradition and confirm it with actual primary resources. It's always great to write down the story your grandmother told you, but try to back it up. And if you do have no luck in locating the source, well, footnote grandmother as your source and put it aside until you can find maybe a record to back it up. But don't forget oral history, but don't rely so heavily on it that it doesn't leave you open for more research options. Locate records online before hiring a researcher or traveling to Scotland to do what you can also do from home. A little timeline of Scottish history. In 1603, Scotland and England share the same sovereign. Well, of course, things get a little turmoil in the middle part of the 17th century when Cromwell comes as the Lord Protectorate of the United Kingdom. And that is where there's a lot of issues going on with Cromwell, with Scotland and Ireland. In 1707, the United Kingdom is formed. By 1715, there is a great rebellion in Scotland, and another one in 1745. And then, of course, the clearings, where they're clearing the Highlands and people are emigrating out. And that was between the 1750s and 1850s, so for a whole century. The earliest immigration. So Scotland's inclusion into Great Britain allowed it to basically get settlement throughout the New World. So you have the early arrivals of people in the 17th century, where most people think it's the 18th century as the start of Scottish immigration. For instance, in Nova Scotia, a very short-lived colony was established not even a decade after the Mayflower arrived in Plymouth in 1629 in Nova Scotia, which at that point was Acadia. In East Jersey, in 1683, there was a Scottish settlement. In South Carolina in 1684. Down near Panama, there was a settlement called New Caledonia at Darien in 1698. In Darien and New Inverness, Georgia in 1736. And of course, the momentum was really slow for immigration to America by the Scots. Now, the Scots have been migrating obviously into Europe since the time of the Middle Ages. So you will find Scottish names peppered in France, you'll find them in England, and obviously in Ireland, the Scots-Irish not being an exception to that. In the 16th and 17th century, they helped colonize the Hebrides, Orkney, and the Shetland Islands. Approximately 50,000 Scots were in Ulster, Northern Ireland by 1650. So your once thought to be purely Irish heritage may in fact be originally Scottish. The Scots-Irish are those who arrived in Ulster from Scotland, and they ultimately moved on to North America, and many arrived actually in Pennsylvania, as you can see from this map showing the migration of the 18th century. The ships often came from Belfast, and those that had come from the American colonies were with flaxseed, and now that they were empty, they made money carrying passengers back to America. It was not exactly your passenger cruise line in the 18th century. Think of merchant ships and the conditions of a merchant ship. So here's a map of some of those short-lived colonies just to geographically point off where they were, up in Nova Scotia, in East Jersey, and in Stewartstown, down in the Carolinas, and down here in Darien, Georgia. And in the lower inset map, you can see almost near Panama. Now, of course, there's also voluntary immigration. In the 17th century, many of the individuals that arrived came from the lowlands part of Scotland, connecting parts of around Edinburgh, Dundee, or even closest to the English border. In the 18th century, the increase of immigration was actually from the Highlands. So you get people from up in the area of Inverness, or even the areas of the Orkneys. Most traveled as indentured servants, paying off their passage initially. I have to work your indenture off. They would often become very enrolled people in the population of a community. You often see a lot of Scottish families that are there and sometimes stay well into the 19th and 20th century. And there are many places in America, Scottstown or a Scottish village name may be part of a neighborhood. So it's very much placed into the culture of America. Immigration began to increase in the 1730s, and this is primarily due to the increase in rents, the clearances that took place in the 18th century during the 1750s to the 1850s were just a small part of that, where you could not pay your rents. You were basically forced to migrate, sometimes to Ireland, and then, of course, sometimes to North America and other places. Between 1763 and 1775, there was an estimate 25,000 Scots immigrating. The small amount of them actually went to Nova Scotia. Hence, you may have heard the name Nova Scotia. It's Latin for New Scotland, especially up in Cape Breton. The land up there was quite similar to what it was like in the Highlands of Scotland. And there are still many, many people of Scottish descent there in Cape Breton now today. The majority settled in the colonies, however. You also get some that did settle into Prince Edward Island. Now, religious discrimination of the Roman Catholics is also another reason for the immigration. Now, the clearance is essentially the eviction of these tenants by their landlords. Again, it takes place for just about a century, the middle of the 1750s, clear until about 1860. There are two phases of this migration clearances, the middle of the 18th century, and then the larger portion took place in the last 35 years between 1815 and 1850. But again, this may be the reason your ancestors coming over. So this is why you want to see the immigration date for your ancestor. And in some cases, maybe you can't find a passenger list. What you want to look for is the earliest occurrence of your ancestor in a record. Did they join a church in America or Canada? Did they buy a piece of land? Were they in court? Did a child get born? Or was there a family member who died and there's a gravestone? Using the earliest occurrence may help you when you cannot find when the immigration date occurs. Now, also the clearances, they went against the Duchess, which is a clan member, inalienable right to rent land in a clan territory. So that was part of the problem here. Farmers became crofters and then, of course, are eventually moving on. Now, many Scottish, especially Highlanders, were actually loyalists. So by the time of the American Revolution, they are ceding more towards the side of the British. And in post-American Revolution, America, you have many Scots elected to leave the 13 colonies and go actually to British Canada or even go back to Scotland. Unfortunately, one of the problems we have with that is we don't have a lot of records of people leaving America on passenger ships or on merchant ships for that matter and crossing into Canada. Sometimes it was by boat. Of course, Canada doesn't have any record of that. So again, looking for records that show your ancestor either back in Scotland or in Canada, like I had mentioned before about arriving to America, look for that earliest instance in the other countries. In the 1790 United States Census, there were 3.9 million people. 6% approximately, or 260,000, were actually known to be Scottish. And of course, the Scottish would have included the Scots-Irish. In 19th century, so Canada was more popular than the US for immigrants, believe it or not. You might think that in the case of most of the immigrants, they would not be going to Canada, but coming for opportunity in America. But actually, and that is contrary. It is that they actually had gone up to Canada more from Scotland. U.S. immigration between 1820 and 1851, Scottish settlers seldom reached the high point of 1,000 immigrants per year. And it actually, in some years, believe it or not, it was under 100 that we can see from the surviving passenger lists. So some 10,525 arrived in those 31 years. And in most cases, that's not even half the population of a small town here in Massachusetts. Determine the origin from US and Canadian resources. Now, when you're looking at records such as vital records, that is usually the go-to place for genealogy. You want those birth, marriage, and death records. Now, maybe the person's death that record you're looking at was born in Scotland. You keep your fingers crossed and hope that it says something more than the United Kingdom or simply Scotland, even if it gives a shire in Scotland they came from, or perhaps near Edinburgh. Get you a pinpoint of some sort. And that's what you're hoping to find is more than just from Scotland. An obituary or a gravestone may give you that. Sometimes gravestones, both in Canada and the United States, will often herald on it the place that the immigrant came from. So you may get the place carved in a gravestone. If it's a small community that the Scottish immigrant lived, he or she may have a lengthy obituary in a smaller paper. Of course, if they live in a city like Boston, they'll probably just simply have a death notice. Naturalization records, as we'll see, also will give you the birthplace in Scotland or where someone is from. That's usually a little bit more than simply Scotland, but that has more to do with the era. Naturalization records start in 1791. You start to see more exact places in naturalization records by the 1840s and 1850s, whereas the earlier ones might just say simply the United Kingdom. And then, of course, passenger list. The limits to passenger list are to the era in which your ancestor came. Many of the Scottish that settled Canada, there are not on many surviving passenger lists for the 18th and 19th centuries until latter of the part of the 19th century do we even find passenger lists that are available from the National Archives up in Ottawa, Canada. For America, we start about 1820 getting really good. 18th century, early 19th century, it's very sketchy in the amount of lists that you will find, but a lot of them are actually already online or been published. For vital records, obviously, why would that help you with the from Scotland? Because the birth record may record the place of birth of the parents of the child. That American or Canadian birth may give you the first clue that you have a Scottish ancestor. Marriage records, recording both the place of birth of one or both spouses, and on the occasion, it may even give the parents' place of birth of the spouses as well. The death record, recording the place of death of the deceased, or in even some cases, their parents. So this may give you that clue to where they are from Scotland, but it may also give you that clue as to exactly where they come from in Scotland. Passenger lists. Passenger lists, like I say, before 1820 are a little limited in what actually survives. So you do want to do a little bit of digging. I would suggest using websites like ancestry.com and findmypast.co.uk, and also Fold3 to see what may survive on both sides of the Atlantic. Do not assume you immediately located your ancestor in these early passenger lists because you may have found a Donald McDonald in your genealogy that seems to match. The very common names, one of the things you have to be a little aware of is that there are going to be common names throughout Scottish passenger lists. What you need to look for is clues such as maybe the wife's name or another family member that's traveling with them. Does that define that the Donald McDonald you have is yours? Is the occupation of that Donald McDonald the right occupation when you know that yours is a tinsmith and this person is a linen draper? Now, post-1820 U.S. passenger list, arrival lists cover most of the Atlantic ports and are consistent from that point on forward. Now, here's an example of a website I did a search for on heritage.statueofliberty.org. It's a free website for those that came in through Ellis Island, and this has a database of over 65 million passengers. So here is my wife's great-grandfather. So I did, well, not maybe him, but someone by his name. Let's see how many John Rennies there are. And that's not a John McDonald name. There are 234 John Rennies. So the next thing I needed to know is, obviously, I don't know the ship name right off. Where their last place of residence? Well, I might just know Scotland, but maybe you know the date. That's when you're looking at your records and knowing that he bought land, shows up on a city directory, maybe has a child born in the middle of the 1920s. So that might give you a clue. So as I look through these 234 on the next screen, I'll find that there's a John Rennie from Dunfermline, Scotland, who came over on the Algeria in 1922. Now, when I do that, I can now turn to ancestry.com. I can do a similar search, but because of handwriting, sometimes you want to be as certain if you already know the name of the ship and the date, I go browse the records. So what we're going to do here is we're going to actually browse the New York arrivals into Castle Garden and Ellis Island. On the right-hand side, I can browse that collection. And then I could select the date, 1922, November 15th, which was the date he arrived. And as you can see, it preloads the ships that are arriving into New York at that point in time. There's the Algeria. Once I click on the Algeria, I can actually get the manifest itself. Now, I had to go through a few pages until I actually found him because they're not always in alphabetical order. But once I did, I was able to glean a little information, which first off was a bit of a surprise. I knew that my wife's grandfather was born in 1920. So in this case, her great grandfather, his dad, was actually traveling by himself. Here he is right at the bottom conveniently. John Rennie, his age, that he is a stoker and that he speaks English, that he's born in Scotland and he's from Dunfermline. And it mentions back where his wife, Rebecca, is living, the exact street address in Dunfermline, Scotland. And he looks like he's going to Vineyard Haven down on Martha's Vineyard. We still haven't figured out why, who he's going to visit. Must be a friend or a relative of some sort. But he made his settlement in Massachusetts and then soon after sent for his family. Now there's more information. Don't let the first page fool you, because if you go to the next screen, you'll see that there's all that additional information. And of course, you want to scan the top columns of the actual list because sometimes you will find clues. In this case, I found out that he was 5'4", he had blue eyes, and that he had been born over in Dundee. Naturalization records. Often the birthplace in Scotland, or at least the county in Scotland, should be listed if you are lucky. Now, in research, the naturalizations are also the ones you want to look for are the witnesses to see if their origins in Scotland are similar. Are these family members? Did they come over together on a passenger list? Did he live in a close-knit community of other Scottish immigrants? So you may find a clue when looking at the witnesses, and look up their naturalizations, because you may find that there is a family member on their naturalization that might be related to yours. Using the approach of family, associates, and neighbors, you may find that witnesses fall under that category. Here's a U.S. naturalization record for my wife's great-grandfather, John Duncan Rennie, who is naturalizing at this point in time in 1925 when he puts his declaration in. And it all matches up that he was on the Algeria right in the middle. It states that. And it gives it his address is now in Somerville, Massachusetts. And I get a nice example of his signature. Now, unfortunately, there's no photograph in this intention or even on his certificate, but this is the first document. And oftentimes you will find the naturalization before you do the passenger list, because it will then give you the date that the person arrived. And that will help you versus sorting through 200 plus John Rennies. Here's an example of an earlier naturalization record from the 19th century, and this is for a Duncan Cochrane, who actually gives the exact place in Scotland that he was born, and that he is applying to be a naturalized citizen in 1878. The other naturalization record has on the back of it, this is one from 1906, you notice that it has witnesses. These are the people that you want to investigate under the fan approach. Are they family? Are they associates, like somebody they work with, go to church with, or maybe they're neighbors on the same street? You'll find them on the census or a city directory. But it's important to look at the fan approach whether you're dealing with immigrants, because you may find clues. Maybe your naturalization doesn't say exactly the village where your great-great-grandfather comes from. But one of the naturalized witnesses on the list may have listed exactly where they were born. If they're in the same county, might be worth checking to see if they're from the same parish back in Scotland. Tip: place of residence or birth may just simply be listed as United Kingdom, Ireland, and Scotland. So take your pick. Obviously, what you're hoping for in this case is to find that they're from Scotland, but look at other records. Don't limit to just one or two. And just the death record shouldn't be the only record you look for a place of birth. Essential Scottish resources. Now, the go-to Scottish records we will talk about are civil records. Of course, that includes birth, marriage, and deaths. We'll talk about parish records, baptisms, marriages, burials, and other records of the parish. We'll talk about census, and those go back to 1841. And of course, there are other records. Of course, this is a getting started, but other things that you may wish to look for: wills and testaments, and of course, land records. So what is the difference between a civil record and a parish record? Now, the civil records, of course, are recorded by control of the government by an act that probably was put forth. And parish records are generally older, but they sometimes complement themselves. You may, in some points in time, you'll have both a birth record and perhaps a baptism record. You'll have a burial record as well as a death record. And you may have a marriage intentions or marriage license or bans in the church. And then you may also have the civil record of marriage. So both of those are a good way to complement, especially when they start in the mid of the 19th century. So parish records may go back into the 17th century, the late 1600s, sometimes the middle 1600s for Scotland. Now, civil records begin in 1855, and we'll be talking a little bit more exactly about that in a moment. Now, the idiosyncrasies in a clerk's record keeping may give you additional information. They may have recorded more than meets the eye. In fact, I find in Scottish baptism records, they will give the maiden name of the mother. If you looked at a baptism record in Boston in 1720, you may be lucky to find the mother's first name, let alone her maiden name. Civil records are on Scotland's people, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the lecture. And the Church of Scotland and Catholic records are also available on Scotland's People. Scotland's People is a pay-per-view site where you buy credits. And if you go with us in June of this year, you can work in the Scotland People Center and have access to the records right there for the fee that we will be paying for your admission. Civil records, statutory registers of birth, marriage, and death begin on the 1st of January, 1855. Now, at that point in time, there were over 1,000 registration districts created in all of Scotland. Now, they kind of chiseled it down a little bit because by 1994, the registration districts was a number of only 360. Now, registration districts are not like counties. In fact, they may often straddle the county line itself. So you may find a registration district in the corner of 3 counties that may converge. Birth records. Well, first, often you must know that you had to register a birth within 21 days after birth, or in some cases you would be fined. You want to include on the birth, it will have the name of the child, obviously, where and when they were born, the information on the father and mother. You will often get the name, the occupation of the father, and the name, the maiden name of the mother, and where and when they were married. Yes, that is a tremendous wealth of knowledge. And in fact, this tradition from Scotland went across the pond to New Scotland. See, in Nova Scotia, when they started recording births in 1864 to 1877, when they stopped, part of the birth record included that same question: when and where were the parents married, to prove the child was actually legitimate. So it gives you a clue to the next step with that birth record. The informant's signature and their qualification of why they can be informant are recorded on the birth, and of course, where and when the birth was registered. Between 1855 and 1918, illegitimate births were identified as such. In fact, I'm going to show you an example. May have a notation that the register of corrected entries will have more information. There may be a letter in there talking about the natural father of the child when the father's name may not be listed on the initial birth. After 1919, the word illegitimate was unlawful. Here's an example of a birth register from 1877. The top entry, number 37, is for the birth of an Archibald Bell, born on the 31st of March at 9 p.m., and it gives you the exact little area of Ammon in the county of Dumfries. It says that he is the son of James Bell, who was a railway porter, and Janet Bell, maiden name Blackstock, who were married in December in 1862. The father's signature appears there. Of course, it's a copy. The original register would have the initial. And then you have the date of when it was recorded. Now, the child was born on March 31st. It's recorded on April 12th, again, within 3 weeks. And it gives you the name of the register. Now, down below, you can see there's a stamp. And obviously, right there next to number 38, we find that Jesse Henderson is illegitimate. This is why you want to then look at the registers for corrected volumes, because it may have additional information. And because that little stamp is there, that does indicate there will be more information. This birth occurred in the 2nd of April, 1877. It lists the mother is Janet Henderson, an agricultural worker, and the mother makes her mark in the second to last column. And that one is recorded on April the 13th, 11 days after her birth. Marriage records. These will include the when, where, and how married. Were they married by a justice of the peace? Were they married by a minister? The name, the age, and occupation of the marital status of the groom will be given, as well as that of the bride. The regular residence of the groom and bride at time of marriage. And of course, the occupation of the fathers of the groom and the bride, and the maiden name of the mothers of the groom and the bride. So you get 2 generations here conveniently put into the same record. Unfortunately, this doesn't give you when the parents are married. We can't get everything, you know, in genealogy. They have to do a little extra work. But in this case, we do have the next generation to look for a marriage record, look for census records, look for the death and birth of the bride and the groom and their parents. So you've got your homework already on just one record. On a marriage record, usually if the parent of the bride or the groom is deceased, the record will state that. So the father's name might give an occupation if he's still alive, but would probably say deceased, and may also give an occupation. It depended on the clerk who wrote it. If a regular marriage is recorded, the names of the officiant and the witnesses are included. If it's an irregular marriage, they could have the date of the conviction, the decree of the declarator, and the sheriff's warrant. But one of my wife's ancestors was married irregularly in the castle in Edinburgh. There, he was a military soldier, and he was irregularly married by a non-Presbyterian minister, not in the Church of Scotland. So they had to remarry, and there was a lot of paperwork associated with it. I was very delighted to find this event. And of course, the date recorded in the name of the register is also on the marriage record. Here's an example for one couple, and a lot of information, as you can see. This is a marriage from the Southern District of Kirkpatrick Fleming in the county of Dumfries in 1879. The 19th of December at Ferry Row, Kilpatrick and Fleming. So we have James Johnston marrying Catherine Irving, gives both their occupations and their marital status. They're both single. He is 25 and she is 23. He was from Irvington and she is from Ferry Row. It tells that the groom's father is James Johnston, who's a hand loom weaver who is deceased. So I told you, in the case of some of these marriage records, it may just say simply deceased, but it may also say the last occupation the deceased parent had. In the case of the mother, it gives Jane Johnston. Hope is her maiden name, and she is also deceased. In the case of the bride, her father, James, is listed, James Irving. He is also a hand loom weaver. Perhaps both fathers worked together in the same mill. And in the case of her mother, who is Catherine Irving, who also was an Irving at birth, she is still alive. It's not indicated that she's deceased. Then you have the signatures of the witnesses, the date of the marriage, and this is a nice little document. And again, Scotland's People will have this document and others starting in 1855 for you to purchase and download at home. Death records. From 1855 to 1860, death records included when the doctor last saw the deceased alive, the place of the burial, and the name of the undertaker. Now, starting in 1861, the spouse's name was reinstated after it began to be eliminated in 1856. So you could find someone who is married, but it doesn't necessarily mean between 55 and 60 that you'll find who it was. Here's an example of a couple death records, including on the, actually it's the same death record with a couple of pages rather, of an individual who's dying in this village in the year of, I'm sorry, it's 1858. So you're getting both the location the person's living, their parents' names, and you're also finding out the cause of death. And this, of course, with health history is so very important. This is obviously a death record dating back to the latter part of the 1850s and something of great use to you. Here's a death in 1872 where Janet Bell, widow, we had met her before, January 29th, 1872. It says that she is the daughter of John Johnston, deceased, and Janet Johnston, her mother. It gives her cause of death in column 6. And then it goes and it tells you who the informant is and how that person is qualified to be the informant. It is her son-in-law. So she is 80 years old when she died in 1872, probably going on 81 since it's January. So I would start looking for a Janet Johnston in the church records starting around 1791. Parish records. There are baptisms, marriages, burials, and there are, of course, other records kept on the parish in Scotland. This includes Kirk session records. Churches in Scotland, we have the Church of Scotland on Scotland's People. There are Roman Catholic church records as well. This also includes nonconformist records for the Society of Friends, Methodist, Episcopal, United Free Church, Congregational, Unitarian, and the Free Church. The Church of Scotland in the 1600s, it was Episcopal in beliefs and traditionally Presbyterian since. Old parish registers cover up until about 1854, and that covers about 900 parishes. That's a fair amount coverage in all of Scotland. There are essentially 3,500 parish registers that predate 1854 that are in the Scottish Archives in Edinburgh. The nice thing, they're all digitized. Identify your parish. There are 33 counties in Scotland and over 900 parishes. So it's so important to know where and do that homework before you go and leap across the pond. Here are all the different counties. This comes from a little website from GenUKI, UK and Ireland genealogy. And that is a great little map there showing the different counties and the breakdowns of them to give you an idea of where your ancestor might have been from in Scotland. Baptism records. A child may be baptized in 2 parishes, the parish of the father or the parish of the mother, and may be recorded in both. The date of the baptism is not the date of birth. This comes across all the time in the UK. I find that people in either England or Ireland or Scotland will write down born, and that isn't always the day the child is baptized. Is not the same day they were born often. Sometimes it is, but do record baptized in the record when you find a baptism, not birth. Baptisms could also be a week or a month after birth, especially if they're living up in the Highlands and that they had a visiting clergyman that would actually go and perform the ceremonies on a sort of irregular basis. Old parish registers are generally Presbyterian. Marriages. A record of the proclamation of banns that the intention of marriage was published in the church and may be recorded in two parishes, one for each the groom and the bride. It was typically read 3 weeks consecutively, essentially giving anyone notice to believe that these two should not be lawfully wed, something we still hear at a wedding today. One of the entries may offer more information for either the bride or the groom. And some ministers may have added additional information, especially if the proclamation was read and a parent or perhaps a spouse of one of the intended bride or groom comes forward. Here's an example of a marriage in 1803 for James Armstrong of Dumfries, who is in the militia, and Margaret Elliott were married at Mufflesburg on the 24th of October, 1803. Now, these early marriages, of course, don't give the parents, but if you stay within the confines of the parish, I would look next for the baptism of the bride and the groom, especially if they're from there, and maybe you'll find the marriage of the parents 25 or so years before. Burial records are unfortunately most uninformative record you can find. With a child's death, you may get an age at the time of death, and sometimes you don't even get the parents on the record. Generally, they include only the name of the deceased and the date of the interment. So you could have a Donald McDonald dying as a small child, and it may not indicate who his parent is. And you also find in parish records, sometimes the parishes don't even have burial records. You have to rely upon gravestones or maybe even probate records, which makes it difficult for researching people that may have been a little less fortunate in the community. Here's an example from Scotland's people.gov.uk of burials that occur in 1753. In this case, we were very lucky. These records are naming the child and who the parent is, but not always does it give the case, especially with an adult. Roman Catholic records, photocopied pre-1855, and they were under the National Records of Scotland. These original records may be with the parish priest, the diocese, and the archdiocese to seek out the originals. Remember, the National Records of Scotland only has photocopied for the earlier pre-1855 Roman Catholic records currently, and they are on Scotland's people. Episcopalian records. The Episcopal Church of Scotland was established from 1603 to 1638 as the official church, and then also in the 1660s. Original records are with the local priest or the diocese. A survey exists of known Episcopal churches, so you don't have to seek too far to find that. Results available from the National Register of Archives for Scotland. Other nonconformist religions, records of Baptist, Congregational, Methodist, Quaker, Unitarian can be found at the National Records of Scotland Centre in Edinburgh. Also in the archives of the area where they exist. So they have these original records, and in some cases, they will actually take them out to show you. Record restricted access does exist for records that may be restricted by the church or the denomination itself, and there may be work going forward to get them digitized. This requires a form of researchers to look at the records itself. So you have to, in some cases, contact the church to see if you can actually view the records. Do a little homework before you go across the pond. Scottish census, 1841 to 1921. Just late last year in 2022, the 1921 census was released. In Scotland, they were taking a census every 10 years since 1801, and except for 1941 during World War II. Unfortunately, the pre-1841 censuses are pretty sparse. They do exist for some places, but not for all. Here's an example of the 1881 Scottish census. First allowed to be viewed on microfilm from the Family History Library. These censuses are things that you can find online in a variety of different websites, from Ancestry to Scotland's People. And then, of course, Family Search has many things as well. They actually indexed the 1881 British Census and Scottish Census many, many years ago on CD-ROM, which was a great insight to a census you had to scroll through that didn't have an index or a sound exit originally. As you can see in this census here, you have the address of the individual. It gives you their name, relationship, their condition of marriage, their age at their last birthday, their occupation, but most conveniently, where they were born. So you can use this to go back a decade or go forward a decade and see if they're in the same area. Luckily, all of these censuses now are indexed. Here's an example of the 1921 census, which gives some great information from the occupant, their address, their relationship, their age, and their birthplace. Gives you also their nationality if they happen not to be from Scotland. It'll give you their occupation and where they were employed and the amount of dependent children they have. So for the case of my wife's grandfather, I found him as an infant with his mother because the father had gone across and was working elsewhere, but had not come to America yet. So I'm curious to where he might be. He doesn't show up on the 21 census himself. Repositories online and on site. So of course, their key websites I've discussed include familysearch.org, which you can sign up for a free account to view digital records. Some of them require affiliate access. I welcome you to come to American Ancestors. We will be open through March 24th, 2023, and closed for the remainder of the year for renovation. But we are available for members and guests who pay a day fee to come in and use our affiliate access. You may also find Scottish records on ancestry.com, which we have a subscription to at NEHCS, findmypast.co.uk, nrscotland.gov.uk, and scotlandspeople.gov.uk, which, as I'd mentioned, is a subscription where you buy credits to use online to download images or search indexes. Scotland's People contains digital information of important Scottish records from both the National Records of Scotland, the Lord Lion Court, that is for heraldic purposes, and the Scottish Catholic Archives, and has a research center right in Edinburgh, which we'll be visiting in June of this year. And of course, has online site access. The website itself at scotlandspeople.gov.uk is very user-friendly. I use it quite often, as well as using it in Scotland in person. Once you create an account and you buy credits with a credit card, you can go forward and do a search. In this case, a search will have old parish registers from 1553 to 1855. Civil statutory registers of birth, deaths, and marriages from 1855 to the current time, divorces from 1984 to current, civil partnerships from 2005 to the current day, dissolutions of civil partnerships, hence divorces, 2007 current when the marriage is annulled, not rather divorced. Registers of birth, deaths, marriages outside of Scotland. These years will vary, but they do have those as well. And Roman Catholic records from 1703 into the early part of the 20th century. Accessing registers. Online, they have the rules that births more than 100 years old are accessible. Marriages, not more than 75 years old, and deaths, more than 50 years old. In the center, you can download and print records as described above. You can also see modern records are on view only, so you can make notes, but you can't get a printout of them. So it's nice that you can look at the more recent records and make notes, and that's what you may do to find that you have a family member still living in Scotland today that might be a distant cousin. And of course, the cost, again, it's purchased by credits, and you use that while you're there. Just a review, you want to confirm your oral history and use original primary source records to secure your stories. Finding that your ancestor lives somewhere near Edinburgh, but finding the naturalization record that pinpoints it right down to Dundee, Scotland, is even better. Determining origins in Scotland for US and Canada resources. looking at those death records, those obituaries, and those gravestones ahead of time before seeking resources over in Scotland. It will help your source get narrowed down to where you're from. Seek out and find passenger list and naturalization records. When you do this, it's going to also increase the chance that you can find that exact place name to locate your ancestors in Scotland. Seek out church records before and after 1855. In some cases, you will have a church that still exists. Their records may not be with Scotland's people, but they may still be recording church records that are accessible in the parish. You want to seek out civil records starting in 1855 for those births, marriages, and deaths, and again, right through the current day. Locate families in Scottish censuses between 1841 and 1921. And look outside the box. Don't research just your direct line. Look for those neighbors. Look for those cousins living next door, and look for those associates that are witnesses in the church records. Find them, see where they are. And remember those people and the witnesses in the naturalization? I want you to adopt them too. Look for those, because all those might give a greater sense of the story of your own immigrant ancestors. Locate probate and land records to glean further details on your Scottish ancestors to add more than just names and dates. And I hope that you join us in Scotland. Again, our Scottish research tour will be with myself, David Allen Lambert, and my colleague, Rhonda McClure. And we will be in Edinburgh from June 18th to June 25th this year. And we will be visiting with the Scotland People Office. We will be at the National Records of Scotland, which has, of course, Scotland's people, the archives. We'll also make a trip over to the National Library of Scotland, which is very far away, right in Old Town of Edinburgh. And we'll also be visiting the Scottish Genealogy Society, which has a treasure trove of information as well. And of course, if you love cemeteries, where we're staying at the Apex Waterloo, there is a beautiful 18th, 19th century cemetery right across the street, because as genealogists, we like to spend our time strolling through a cemetery, don't we? Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. I look forward to answering your questions and hopefully seeing you either in Boston or one of our trips, or maybe even with us in Scotland.
All right, well, thank you, David. So a few questions. Carl asked about passenger lists to the colonies for the 1600s. You mentioned that those are kind of sparse, but some have been published. Where do you kind of turn to see what's available?
Well, 17th century passenger lists to the colonies, say for instance, New England. We have a great resource in a man by the name of John Camden Houghton, who published a book called Persons of Quality. And this has all the surviving passenger lists from the UK. For the most part, there are some supplements to this, covering about the 1620s right through the 1650s and 60s. For New England, for instance, we start to see the multitude of passenger lists that survive, or other records. That would be the permission to embark. You had to get legal permission to embark from Britain in those days, especially if you were seeking religious freedom, and that may be the record you find, not essentially a passenger list. But by the time of the 1640s and 50s, straight on through the remainder of the 17th and into the 18th century, it's very limited. If they did keep records, they haven't survived into the 21st century.
And now we also have several questions about records and record availability for Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm. So civil registration for Nova Scotia starts in 1864. That would be for birth, marriages, and deaths. They stopped recording births and deaths in 1877 and didn't resume it again until 1908. Marriage records are kept since 1864 consistently right through. Censuses in Nova Scotia don't begin until 1851, and they're head of household for 51 and 61, and start with the entire family in 71. However, probates, deeds, there is a tremendous wealth of records in those. At NEHGS, we have thousands of rolls of microfilm of the Nova Scotia probates, deeds, vital records, through the generosity of a good friend, Robert Hendrickson, who helped us gather this collection years ago. Now, many of these things you can find now online through familysearch.org, but do come in and peruse our collections. And of course, I can answer any other questions you have on Nova Scotia as well.
You mentioned some of the American records to use in order to find kind of more exact locations where your ancestors are from. Someone also mentioned military records as being especially useful in that regard. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. In fact, in Edinburgh, at the castle, you will find the tremendous archive of Scottish military ephemera, flags, the uniforms and whatnot. And they actually, in Scotland, at the Scotland Archives, you will find the records itself. Now, the problem with the Scottish military, you start to find records starting in the 18th century. Looking for military records before that is very, very difficult to pinpoint. There are surviving miscellaneous rolls, etc. But for the most part, it's an 18th century record forward. And if your ancestor was in a clan and they had a military action, that was a clan that was fighting, that wouldn't be sort of the organized Scottish or British militia per se.
Now we have several questions about the Scots-Irish and kind of what resources to turn to if you're looking for that particular group.
Well, the first thing I would do is look at everything on this side in America. I would look for published genealogies, especially Scots-Irish, since they've been here since the early part of the 18th century in most cases. There may be a genealogy. There already might be a Y-DNA study group, and that's going to be one of your strongest suits, especially if you can't find anything more than just that they were Scots-Irish and you've got them in Londonderry in Northern Ireland. Y-DNA is going to breach that problem. Being a male with the surname, your Y-DNA may pinpoint an exact match over in Scotland. That is still a Mackenzie. That could be that. You may also want to look at contacting the Scottish clan heads over in Scotland itself for a particular family. They may have knowledge of certain members of one clan or the other that were part of the clearances that either came to America or went first to Northern Ireland. When you're dealing with records in Northern Ireland over in Belfast at these are going to be a little limited. Unfortunately, a lot of times you will find them in the records, but they may not echo that they came from a particular village in Scotland. That's why in the 21st century, we're so fortunate with Y-DNA research, because it may help us land our ancestors back in Scotland when we're stuck in Northern Ireland.
A few questions about land and probate records. We didn't have time to really delve into those. And I will say that those are probably a little more advanced records than getting started. But Frederick asks, are there probate and land records available online?
There are. In fact, you'll find a good amount of them available through Scotland's People website. You may also want to look at Family Search and see what may have been abstracted or transcribed. In some cases, there are records that are accessible through Family Search. You, of course, can get for free, but Scotland's People is going to be the quick go-to for those type of records. And of course, for various land records with very large, beautiful vellum documents, or to look and see the original records, again, please come with us to Scotland in June and see these firsthand. History is in color, not always just in black and white.
And of course, if you are interested in joining us for the Scottish Research Tour in June, you can go to americanancestors.org/events. You'll find the itinerary and more information about that tour that David and Rhonda will be joining us on. So we'd love to have you join us. I will say, it's best if you do know where in Scotland your ancestors are from, because so many of the records are arranged by locality. And if you have questions about that, or if you're not sure, do I have enough information? Certainly reach out to us. You can reach out to David directly, Rhonda directly. You can reach out to me, our membership team. Basically, anyone that you have an email for at any HGS will point you in the right direction. So we'd love to have you join us. Let's see. Another question, what would you say is kind of the best go-to resource or maybe guide for doing Scottish research? Do you have kind of a go-to book that you use?
I do, actually. In the syllabus, we have a breakdown of a variety of Scottish research books. It really comes down to what specific topic in Scottish research you're looking for. As far as there is a wonderful guide that was produced by the Scotland's People Centre that was produced just a few years ago. I don't have the title right off the top of my head, but it is in the syllabus, which is not in front of my screen that I can't divulge right now. But if you want to drop me a note, I can definitely tell you a couple of the best general guides to Scotland if you'd like.
All right, and maybe one last question. Several people are looking into those early records, 17th, 18th century Scottish records. Especially for 17th, what would you say is kind of the most important record, or, are they parish records? Is it something else?
Well, it depends on what station in society your ancestor was. I mean, obviously, if your ancestor was a lord of a manor, there'll be a variety of records, court records, there may be legal records, there may be, of course, records from the manor itself. If your ancestor was a farmer, what you're going to hope for is maybe you're going to find a parish record that goes back far enough, or find a diary of the local clergyman who was at the parish and may have wrote things down. Again, the earlier you go back, the less likelihood, as you could see, the 16th century, there, when the parish records date to, for the most part, they seem to be there in the 17th century, the 1600s. And then for some parishes, for me, have been from fire, or maybe they hadn't started yet. That's one thing to keep in mind, that your ancestor may live in one village, but they may have traveled further to another. So you need to pinpoint on a map the outskirting parishes that when your ancestors' records say maybe they go to 1713, but maybe a parish or two over they may have traveled to, because that is where they all went to church in the 1670s, and the church records go back to the 1660s. So kind of look at a map and sort of write down the dates of the earliest parish records for each community. That might help you as well.
All right. Well, thank you again, David. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. Of course, there were several questions that we couldn't get to today in today's kind of limited time, but you can always reach our genealogist by using our free service that's open to the public. You can chat with the genealogist if you just go to americanancestors.org/chat. So if you have reference questions, what resource guide should I turn to? How do I read this old handwriting? Any questions like that, we're happy to help you as best we can. Again, that service is available Tuesday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern time, with extended hours on Wednesdays, 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. again, Eastern time. And to access that service, you just go to americanancestors.org/chat. Again, you don't have to be a member. It's free and open to the public. All right, so thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create other free programs for you and for other audiences. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, the research tour that we're doing in June to Scotland, or any other activities, be sure to visit us at americanancestors.org. Best of luck in your research, and I hope to see you at our online and in-person programs in the future. Goodbye for now.